The throne room of King's Landing had never felt colder. Ned Stark sat on the Iron Throne, his grey eyes hard as steel, but beneath them was a man torn in half. The crown on his head was heavy, not in gold, but in the burden of what it had. Cost. His hand gripped the wolf-emblazoned armrest, as if bracing against the weight of ghosts. The great sept of Baelor still stood, silent and intact, but the city murmured. It hadn't been long since Robert Baratheon had died in that hunting accident, and already the kingdom's back rooms were echoing with secrets. Ned had not wanted the throne. 7 hells he had refused it. But when Joffrey claimed the crown and chaos broke loose, it was Stannis who should have risen next. Instead, Stannis' ships were mysteriously delayed in Dragonstone, and Renly declared himself king with a smile and flowers. The city turned to Ned, the only man they trusted who hadn't lied, stolen, or slaughtered his way into power. And so, the honor-bound wolf had taken the crown to stop a war, not realizing it had already begun. Catelyn had stood by his side the day he was crowned. Her eyes hadn't sparkled like a queen's. They'd looked afraid, protective. Sansa had smiled, trained by the courtiers to play her part. Arya had scowled. Bran and Rickon remained at Winterfell, far from the Game of Thrones. Only Jon Snow wasn't there. He was still on the wall, a brother of the Night's Watch. Ned's heart ached whenever he thought of the boy. No, the man he hadn't truly claimed. How could he now, when his own crown cast doubts on every truth he'd once lived by? Varys had whispered warnings. Littlefinger had vanished after Ned's ascension, his ambitions dashed when Ned chose justice over scheming. The Lannisters had pulled back, licking their wounds. Tywin had retreated to Casterly Rock, but no one believed he'd stay idle for long. And Cersei, she had sworn revenge, not for Joffrey, not for the throne, but for the insult of losing. Ned's first decree had been to restore peace and legitimacy to the realm. He ordered investigations into the crown's debts. He cut lavish feasts, sent gold to the Night's Watch, and tried to rebuild roads in the Riverlands. But the South didn't want a just king. They wanted a victorious one. And worse still, dragons stirred in the east. Whispers of a silver-haired girl with fire in her blood drifted in from beyond the narrow sea. Ned tried to ignore them, focus on the present. But the past refused to stay buried. One night, as the candlelight danced on the walls of the Red Keep, Ned stood alone in the chamber once used by Robert. Ghosts filled the room. He saw Lyanna's face in the flames, not begging for vengeance, but for protection. He remembered her last words, "Promise me, Ned." And now, as King of the Seven Kingdoms, those words haunted him, because if the truth ever came out about Jon Snow, if the world knew who he really was, Ned might lose everything. Again. Then a knock came at the chamber door. Sir Barristan entered, face grim. "My king," he said, bowing low, "there's been a raven from the wall. You need to see this." Ned's gut twisted. "Is it Jon?" "No, Your Grace," Barristan said, handing over the sealed scroll. "It's worse." Ned broke the seal with trembling fingers. The parchment crackled like dry leaves as he opened it, his eyes scanning the rough, urgent script. "The dead walk. We are losing men. Lord Commander Mormont requests aid. Winter is no longer coming. It is here." He read it again, slower, as if the words might shift into something less terrifying. But they didn't. The message was clear. Something unnatural had stirred beyond the wall, and the Night's Watch was faltering. The North, his North, was under threat, and it was a threat swords and honor could not defeat. He handed the scroll to Sir Barristan, who read it in silence, his jaw tightening. "This cannot be ignored," the old knight said. "No," Ned replied, voice low. "It cannot." But how could he act? The crown was already slipping through his fingers. The reach had grown colder toward him since he denied Renly's claim. The Westerlands, still seething from Jaime's capture and Tywin's humiliation, had cut off all support to the crown. And the small folk? They were beginning to mutter that the wolf from the north didn't understand their ways, their gods, or their hunger. He needed allies, but more than that, he needed time he no longer had. Later that night, he met with his small council. The chamber was tense, stripped of the easy corruption that had once lingered there under Robert and his wine-soaked rule. Grand Maester Pycelle had been replaced with a younger, sharper healer from Oldtown. Sir Davos Seaworth now sat at the table, having sailed from Dragonstone after Renly's death in a sudden, mysterious fire. Varys was still there, always watching, always knowing too much. "The wall is not our concern," Lord Giles of Rosby coughed through yellow teeth. "The North has its own bannermen. Let them freeze if they must." Ned's eyes snapped to him, cold and sharp. "The wall protects us all, my lord. You may not feel the wind from beyond it, but it will reach King's Landing soon enough." Varys steepled his fingers. "The realm has not seen a true winter in decades, your grace. This threat changes the game." "It's not a game," Ned muttered, more to himself than them. Davos leaned forward. "We must send men, food too. If the watch falls, the dead will not stop at Winterfell." "But Pycelle's replacement, Maester," Torrhen frowned. "How do we know it's not wildling tricks or some madness from too much cold? The North is full of tales." Ned had heard enough. "Stories or not, I know the wall," he said firmly. "I've seen what lives in those forests. We ride north. I'll send word to the bannermen, all of them. Stark or not, they swore, to the realm. And the realm will answer." The room fell silent. They knew what it meant. War in the north would leave the south vulnerable. If Tywin struck now, or if Daenerys crossed the sea with her dragons, if they even existed, there would be no defense. Still, Ned chose. "I will lead the host myself," he said. "The Night's Watch will not stand alone." Davos nodded with grim approval. "I'll sail to White Harbor and carry your command." As the council dispersed, Varys lingered. "You are not like the others, Ned Stark. You rule from duty, not desire. But duty cuts deeper than ambition ever could." Ned turned to him. "If we fall, tell me. Will your little birds sing us a dirge?" Varys offered a thin smile. "They already are." That night Ned visited the godswood of the Red Keep. Beneath the weirwood, its red eyes crying sap, he knelt alone. He did not pray for victory. He prayed for time, for the strength to hold the kingdom together. But the winds were shifting, and in the frost-bitten dark of the far north, something ancient had begun to march. The north welcomed its king with silence. As Ned rode through the gates of Winterfell for the first time in over a year, the cold bit deeper than he remembered. Snow dusted the old stones like a warning, not a welcome. He dismounted slowly, his joints aching more than they should. Behind him rode Sir Rodrik Cassel, Davos Seaworth, and a dozen of the King's Guard in stark grey and black, not Lannister gold. That alone had unsettled half of Westeros. Inside the great hall, Maester Luwin waited with Bran and Rickon. The boy lord stood tall, though Bran leaned heavily on a carved staff now, his legs twisted but his gaze sharp. Rickon, still wild and angry, didn't say a word. The direwolves, Shaggy Dog and Summer, they prowled the shadows, larger and more restless than ever. "Father," Bran greeted him with a voice that carried something heavier than childhood. Ned embraced his sons, but his heart twisted when he looked at Bran. The fall still haunted him, and not just because it had broken the boy's body. It had set off a chain of events that had changed everything. Maester Luwin handed him a fresh Raven scroll. "More reports from Castle Black," he said. "They speak of whites, reanimated corpses. The old tales come alive." Ned's face darkened. "I need to see it for myself." And he did. Within a fortnight, the king's host, a modest but hardened force of Stark men, northern bannermen, and a handful of knights loyal to the crown, pushed through the biting winds toward the wall. It was a grim, silent march. They passed burned villages, fields gone fallow under the frost, and shepherds who spoke of seeing dead men walking at night, eyeless and pale. When they finally arrived at Castle Black, Jon Snow stood on the wall to meet him. Father and son, though neither had ever dared say it aloud. Jon looked older, harder. His black cloak billowed in the wind, and Ghost padded beside him, white as bone. "My lord," Jon said, formal and steady. "Jon," Ned replied, voice low. Neither moved for a moment. The wall loomed behind them like a second sky, casting a cold shadow across the men gathered below. "I came because of your message," Ned said, "and because I trust you." John's jaw clenched. I wish I were wrong. They didn't talk about family, not yet. There wasn't time. Instead, John led him to the bodies. They lay inside a locked chamber. Men once thought lost on a ranging, now returned as monsters, blue eyes like glass, skin pale as moonlight. Ned felt the chill in his bones. These were not tales for children, this was real. We burned them, John said. It was the only way. Does the realm know? No, he replied. They wouldn't believe us, but they will. When? It's too late. Ned turned to Maester Aemon, frail and blind, but sharp as ever. The dead march, Aemon said. The long night may return, and if the realm is divided, it will not survive. For the first time since taking the throne, Ned Stark felt afraid. Not of losing power, not of war, but of failing the living, of repeating the mistakes of history, the kind sung about long after bones have turned to dust. That night he wrote letters, one to each major house, one to the Citadel, one sealed with wax and no name, addressed to Daenerys Targaryen in Essos. He no longer had the luxury of pretending she wasn't real. And then he wrote one more letter, just 3 words. Come to me. It was for Jon. The next day, the cold deepened, and beyond the wall a horn sounded, not once, not twice, 3 times. Jon's blood froze. They're here. The wall trembled, not with force but with fear. That sound, 3 blasts of the horn, had not echoed across the north in centuries. It meant only one thing: the others had returned. Men scrambled across the ramparts of Castle Black. Some dropped weapons, others prayed. But Jon stood frozen, his eyes staring into the white horizon where wind howled and shadows moved in unnatural silence. Ned Stark looked over the edge. The tree line far below near the haunted forest was still, too still. The snow didn't fall in flakes anymore. It hung in the air like the breath of something waiting. Prepare the defenses, he ordered. But your grace, Sir Roderick began. Ned didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. They are already here. Within the hour, Castle Black was a fortress again. Fires were lit, arrows soaked in oil. Dragonglass daggers, once dismissed as myths, were passed out like relics of hope. Samwell Tarly, sweat beading down his pale face, showed Maester Luwin crates of the black shards gathered from an old cache discovered in a forgotten cave. Jon moved through the men, steady, calm, his sword Longclaw glinting in the firelight. Ghost growled low at his side, tail rigid. Keep the fire burning, Jon told them. Do not let them close. And if one of us falls... He didn't finish the sentence. They all understood. Ned watched his son, no, his nephew, and felt a pain deeper than any blade could reach. Jon had grown in ways he could never have seen from a throne. Duty, not birth, had shaped him. The first wight came at nightfall. A scout maybe, its eyes blue, hands clawed, mouth split in an eternal scream. Arrows slowed it, but only when Jon ran it through with dragonglass did it fall and stay down. Then more came. 10, 20, 100. They poured from the trees like ice-born nightmares, unafraid of pain or death. Men screamed. Fire took some. Steel shattered on others. One of the Night's Watch brothers, a boy barely grown, froze in fear and was torn apart before he could scream. And then the White Walkers arrived, tall, silent, cloaked in frost and death. Their blades, crystal and cold, turned steel to mist. One of them struck down Sir Morin with a single slash, and the knight shattered like glass. Ned fought. He fought as he had not fought since the rebellion, sword in hand side by side with Jon, defending the wall not as king and bastard, but as warriors. A frozen wight lunged at him, and only Ghost's fury saved Ned from being gutted. The direwolf's jaws clamped on its throat and tore it apart with a snarl. Flames danced against snow. Smoke choked the air. Still, the dead came. Ned took a wound, deep, across his shoulder, but he didn't fall. He pressed forward, ignoring the burn in his lungs and the blood soaking through his furs. And then, just as it seemed the wall might fall, a second horn blast echoed through the black sky, then a third. But this time, it came not from Castle Black. It came from the south. A second army had arrived, but not of the dead. Stannis Baratheon. His banner flew beside the flaming heart of R'hllor, and behind him marched men with fire in their eyes and red priests at their side. Lord Davos had done more than send word. He'd brought war to the wall. The tide turned. Dragonglass met cold flesh. Fire swallowed darkness. And the White Walkers, for all their fury, did not like to burn. By dawn, the snows were red. Hundreds of men were dead. But so were the others, and those who survived looked at Jon Snow differently now. Not as a bastard, not as a brother, as a leader, as something more. Later, inside the keep, Ned sat beside the fire, his wound stitched, his soul heavier than ever. Jon stood across from him. "You led them," Ned said quietly. "You kept them alive." "I just did what I had to." Ned looked at him for a long time. The fire cracked between them. The flames danced in Jon's dark eyes. "Your mother," Ned whispered, "was my sister." Jon froze. "What?" "I made a promise," Ned said, voice hoarse, "to Lyanna, to protect you. Your name isn't Snow, it's Targaryen." Jon staggered back as if struck. "Your father was Rhaegar." The room was silent. Outside, the snow began to fall again, not soft, but with purpose. Winter had come. The truth settled on Jon like a blade to the chest. Targaryen. It rang in his ears like a foreign language. Everything he had believed, the shame of his birth, the whispers behind his back, the cold distance between him and Catelyn, the vow to wear black forever, all of it had been built on a lie of love and fear. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Ned just watched him, eyes hollow, hands trembling slightly. "I kept it from you because it was the only way to keep you safe. If Robert had known, you'd have been dead before your first step." Jon stepped back toward the fire, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "You let me think I was a bastard. You let me live a lie." "I let you live," Ned said, not softly, but firmly. "I gave you my name when it could have cost me everything. I loved you like my own. I still do." But Jon was already somewhere else. In his mind he saw visions, Lyanna, dying in bloodied sheets, whispering, "Promise me." Rhaegar, a name spoken like a curse, now twisted into something else. Daenerys, a woman across the sea, his aunt, his blood, a dragon-blooded queen, and himself, the last living male Targaryen, no longer Jon Snow, no longer nobody. Aegon. He hated it. Later, after the fires had been stoked and the dead buried beneath the ice, Stannis arrived at the war room. His face was as sour as ever, his crown nowhere in sight but his presence loud. "You took the crown," Stannis said without ceremony. "It should have been mine." Ned faced him, not as a lord, but as a man who had stood in blood with the dead. "You were not in King's Landing when it mattered." "And you think wearing a crown makes you fit to rule?" Stannis snarled. "You think honor wins wars?" "No," Ned said, "but dishonor loses kingdoms." The room was quiet. Davos beside Stannis said nothing, but his eyes showed where his loyalty lay now. It wasn't with titles. It was with those who bled for the living. "You've seen what's coming," Ned continued. "The dead don't care about our names or our crowns. We either stand together or we fall as ashes." Stannis was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he gave a reluctant nod. "The fire priests say there's a prince who was promised. A child of ice and fire, a Targaryen with the blood of the north." His eyes flicked to Jon, who stood stiff and silent near the door. Ned didn't speak. He couldn't. The irony cut too deep. Stannis turned and left with a sweep of his cloak, leaving the weight of prophecy in the air like smoke. That night Jon sat atop the wall alone. Ghost sat beside him, unmoving. The sky stretched wide above, stars hidden by thick, churning clouds. Snow fell again. He felt no warmth, no clarity, no power, just hollow. A Targaryen. His blood sang, served dragons and wildfire, but his heart was forged in the cold north, in Winterfell, with Robb and Arya and Bran and Rickon, with the Starks. His family. And now he wasn't sure who he was anymore. Ned joined him in silence. "I never wanted to be king," Jon finally said. "Neither did I," Ned replied. "I don't want a throne. I don't want to fight lords or ride dragons." Ned looked out into the darkness. "We don't get to choose what we're made of, Jon, only what we do with it." "Do you believe it?" Jon asked, turning to him. "That I'm the prince they whisper about?" Ned shook his head. "I don't believe in prophecies. I believe in men, and I believe in you." They sat in silence after that. Below them, men mended walls and counted losses. Fires crackled weakly. The wind howled like a warning, and far away, far across the sea, 3 dragons rose over a burning city, and Daenerys Targaryen dreamed of a throne made of swords. The game wasn't over. It had only just changed. Far to the east, across the dark waters of the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen stood at the edge of a charred battlefield. Smoke curled in the sky like the arms of fallen gods. The corpses of slave masters, soldiers, and terrified nobles lay scattered across the blood-soaked sand of Meereen's outskirts. Drogon circled above, his wings casting a shadow so large it swallowed armies whole. Rhaegal and Viserion perched on the broken towers behind her, restless, their hunger never quite satisfied. The battle had been brutal, but it was over. Daenerys had won. And still, she felt no peace. Missandei approached, soft-footed and quiet. "The ships are ready. The men await your word." Dany nodded slowly. "And the letter?" "From the west. It came by Raven 2 days ago." Missandei handed her the sealed parchment, the wax broken, the words memorized. "The wall holds for now, but winter falls hard. If you are what they say you are, come. The realm needs fire." Ned Stark, King of Westeros. The name stirred something deep in her. Stark. She remembered Viserys snarling that name like it was poison, the house that had betrayed their father, that had stood by while her family burned. But this letter, it was not from a usurper. It was not arrogance or command. It was warning. And the strange part was she believed it. She looked east, toward the corpses of the old world she had burned down. Then she looked west, toward the land her blood had claimed but never touched. "To Westeros," she whispered. "To the war that matters." Back in the north, Ned Stark stared into his war table in Winterfell's great hall. The chill of winter pressed through the ancient stones, but his thoughts were elsewhere, beyond the walls of politics, beyond the weight of alliances. He had summoned his bannermen, sworn lords, and even former enemies. House Manderley had answered. So had House Karstark, wary but present. Lady Lyanna Mormont had arrived on her own, fierce and sharp-tongued. And Glover, Hornwood, Reed, even old House Umber had sent their gruff, bitter warriors. But the tension was still there. Whispers of a Targaryen in the north had begun to spread. Some looked at Jon differently now, no longer as the bastard of Winterfell, but as something far more dangerous. The north remembered. And the north did not forgive easily. "They'll never follow a dragon," Sir Roderick said, voicing what many felt. "He was raised as Stark," Ned replied, "and he has bled for the north more than most born to it." Roderick frowned. "But when the time comes, will he choose Winterfell or the Iron Throne?" Ned had no answer. Jon had changed since the battle at the Wall. He was quieter, harder to read. There was fire in him now. Not the kind that burns, but the kind that consumes slowly, like guilt. He had refused to talk further about his blood, his name. But it showed in his eyes, in the way he looked at maps, at armies, at ravens from the south. Arya had returned quietly from the Riverlands. She didn't speak much, and what she did say left Ned wondering what had happened to the little girl who once begged to fight with swords. Now she moved like a shadow, always watching, always near Jon. "They'll come for him," she said, simply one evening. "Who will?" "Everyone, because he scares them." In the south, the Lannisters stirred again. Cersei had married her cousin Lancel under the twisted guidance of a new faith that had grown from fire and fear. The faith, militant, had risen. King's Landing burned incense and fed the poor, while quietly sharpening knives. Cersei knew the wolves had claimed the crown, and she would not stand by. She sent gold to the Iron Bank of Braavos, sent letters to the Golden Company. She even whispered promises to Euron Greyjoy, mad king of the sea. But most of all, she planned Plots within plots, vows sworn in darkness, and then came the news she feared most. Daenerys Targaryen had landed, not with a whisper, but with 3 dragons and a fleet of ships. The game had changed again. In Winterfell, Jon stood before a hearth, Longclaw resting at his side. "I don't want it," he told Arya. "The crown, the throne, any of it." "But what if it wants you?" she asked. He said nothing, because deep inside, something was stirring. A hunger, a pull, blood called to blood, fire called to ice. And across the realm, people began to whisper a name not heard in decades. Aegon. The sky above Dragonstone burned red. Daenerys stood atop the ancient Targaryen fortress, the sea wind tugging at her silver hair. Drogon's wings flapped lazily above her, casting massive shadows across the stone. The narrow channel that once separated her from her birthright now felt like nothing more than a puddle. She was home, or close enough to taste it. But it wasn't the Iron Throne. She dreamed of that night. It was the wall, the cold, the dead. And the man with Stark eyes and Targaryen blood, who had written her not as a rival but as an equal. Jon Snow. Her council had grown quiet since arriving. Tyrion advised caution, Missandei, loyalty, Grey Worm, strength, and Varys, ever the spider, whispered things that kept her awake long into the night. "King Eddard is a man of honor," he told her one evening. "Too much of it he may bend, but he will not break. And if the boy Jon is what you think he is, then Westeros may not need a queen. It may already have a king." She did not respond, but her silence was a blade sharper than any steel. In Winterfell, the tension tightened with every raven that arrived. Reports of Daenerys' landing spread through the halls like wildfire. Some feared dragons, others feared war, and some, like Lady Mormont, simply asked the obvious, "Are we still the North, or are we part of a dragon's dream now?" Ned convened the lords in the great hall. He stood beneath the direwolf banners of House Stark, crown resting on the stone table beside him, not on his head. "We cannot win this war alone," he began. "The dead are real. I've seen them. Fought. Them. And I will not ask you to fight ice and fire with steel and pride." The murmurs began, murmurs of ancient oaths, old feuds, of fathers burned by dragons and mothers lost to southern greed. And then Jon stood. He didn't speak like a lord. He didn't speak like a king. He spoke like a man who had bled in the snow and watched brothers die screaming in the dark. "If she comes to burn," Jon said, "then let the North rise. But if she comes to fight the dead, to stand with us, then we do not have the luxury to refuse her." Ned said nothing. He watched his son, no, his heir, command the room without effort, without crowns or pageantry. He saw Rhaegar's blood in Jon's brow, but Lyanna's fire in his voice. And something inside him broke. Later, Ned found Jon alone in the tea. "Crypts. You will have to meet her," he said. "Not as Snow, not even as Stark." Jon turned slowly. "Then as what?" Ned's voice trembled. "As what you are. As Targaryen." The words hung like iron chains between them. Jon looked at the statues of Stark kings, stone wolves staring down at him with judgment carved in cold. "I don't want her throne," Jon said. "I don't want any of it." "But the people might," Ned replied. "And if they do, I'll tell them no." Ned shook his head. "You may not get to." 3 days later, Daenerys arrived at Winterfell. Her dragons circled. Once before landing in the snowy fields outside the walls, the roar of Drogon sent men ducking, horses fleeing. The air sizzled with heat and fear. Northern soldiers reached for weapons until Jon barked a single word. "Stand down." Daenerys entered with her guard behind her, cloaked in black and red. Her eyes met Jon's across the courtyard. No warmth, but no hostility either. Curiosity, recognition. They stood before each other, fire and ice. "You're not what I expected," she said. "Neither are you." They didn't smile, they didn't bow, they simply stared, 2 storms about to crash. Inside the great hall, Ned greeted her with dignity. No crown, no speeches, just a look that said, "I know what you are, and I will see what you do." "We welcome you," he said, But understand this, the North is loyal, not to thrones, to survival. I'm not here to conquer, Daenerys replied. I'm here to save the realm. Then save it, Ned said, or leave before the snow buries us all. As night fell, Jon found Daenerys alone near the Godswood, snow falling gently on her black cloak. You're not afraid of me, she said. No, Jon replied. I've seen worse than dragons. They stood in silence, only the creak of trees and the crackle of distant torches between them. You believe the dead are coming? She asked. They're already here. And finally Daenerys said it, softly like a prophecy whispered through time. Then we stand together, fire and ice. But the fire was rising too fast, and the ice was already cracking. Winterfell did not sleep that night. The fires burned high. The gates were sealed. Archers stood watch on the walls while soldiers paced in tight, nervous circles. Beneath their boots, the frozen ground seemed to hum, as if something ancient stirred beneath the snow. In the war room, Daenerys stood across from Jon, the map between them stained with old blood and ash. Ned, leaning on the table with one arm wrapped in fresh bandages, said nothing as the two youngest warriors debated. No southern host is coming, Jon said, his voice rough. Cersei's armies are waiting for us to die, then take what's left. She broke her word, Daenerys added, her jaw tight. She thinks she can wait it out, that the dead will finish us and spare her the trouble. She's wrong, Ned said. The dead don't bargain. A new raven had arrived that morning, a single line written by a desperate hand at Eastwatch. The wall is fallen, the Night King rides a dragon. The silence that followed lasted minutes. Even the fires seemed to dim. Jon stared into the map like it might rewrite itself. Then he's coming for us. Ned looked at Daenerys. You have dragons. I had 3, she said bitterly. Now he has 1. The room fell into grim planning. Dragonglass was distributed. Fires were readied at every corner. The smiths worked through the night, forging spears tipped with obsidian. The old crypts were cleared, not to hide in, but to keep the dead from rising there. They didn't speak of victory, only of surviving. The first night. When the horns finally blew, it wasn't with the madness of panic, not yet. But the sound was deeper this time, like the wind itself had started screaming. Jon stood on the battlements as the storm rolled in. Not snow, but something colder. An unnatural darkness that swallowed torches and killed sound. He could feel them before he saw them, the dead. They didn't march like men. They moved like a wave, bone and frost and fury. Wights crawled across the snow with twisted limbs. Animals long dead, bears, direwolves, giants, surged forward as weapons of nightmare. And above it all, the Night King rode Viserion, his dragon now a beast of ice and death, its breath turning flame to frost. Then Winterfell burned. Dragons screamed through the sky, Drogon and Rhaegal diving in tandem, unleashing fire that turned the first wave of the dead to ash. But even as thousands fell, thousands more kept coming. Jon led the charge at the gate, Longclaw flashing with cold light. Arya moved like smoke, vanishing and reappearing behind enemies with a blade in each hand. The North fought like wolves, biting, clawing, refusing to break. Daenerys burned everything in her path, but the Night King would not fall. He raised his arms, and every fallen man became an enemy. Soldiers screamed as their dead comrades turned on them. Then Rhaegal fell, pierced by frost-laced spears. Dany screamed and circled low on Drogon, fury burning in her eyes. Jon found the Night King in the chaos, standing atop a hill of corpses, sword drawn, Viserion behind him like death's crown. Now, Jon whispered, it ends. He ran. The two clashed, steel on ice, fire against frost. Jon fought like a man possessed, but the Night King didn't bleed. He didn't breathe. He just was, ancient and silent. Then Arya came, leaping from the shadows, dagger in hand, Valyrian steel gleaming. The Night King turned, grabbed her, but she dropped the blade, caught it with her other hand, and drove it into his throat. Silence. Then the Night King shattered. The Wights screamed and collapsed. Viserion fell in pieces from the sky. The storm vanished like breath in winter. It was done. The snow was stained red. The courtyard of Winterfell was piled with bodies, living and dead. The fires smoldered. But the sky began to clear. Jon helped Arya to her feet. "How did you—" "I aimed for where it would hurt." Daenerys landed beside them, covered in ash and blood, eyes wild. Jon met her gaze. "It's over." But Ned Stark, standing with his sword planted in the ground, said what none of them wanted to hear. "No, now it begins." Because now the question remained, who would rule? The girl with dragons and conquest in her blood, or the boy with ice in his veins and a crown in his name? The dead were gone, but the living, they were about to go to war.